and it is a pleasure to introduce the speaker of the today. But he joined IIT Kanpur and did his MSc. After doing MSc, he did his PhD from ISC Bangalore in 1997. Then he joined as a faculty member in the Department of Physics, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. And while he was working there, he got a chance to work as a special faculty at the Department of Physics at Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh, USA. And he spent there 2 years from 2002 to 2004. And while on returning, he did some, he spent some time at university, Guru Nanak Dev University, from where he then joined as a faculty member at IIT Madras in 2000. Then he joined 2000 in 2005 at ISC Mohali, and this joining was in 2007. From there, he has been working there since then, and he was heading Department of Computer Science for 7 years, from 2007 to 2014, and he is presently working as a coordinator of outreach activities as Mohali. And Professor Arvind, he has also received INSA Young Scientist Medal in 2000, and various national and international publications are to his credit. Though he is a theoretical physicist, but he is equally interested in experimental research work also. He has contributed many seminars, and he has developed so many experiments for physics education, which he is also engaged himself and organizes meetings and debates which are beneficial to the society. And he has, right now he is also writing many articles of public interest in newspapers as well. And with this brief introduction, I now invite Professor Arvind to start his today's lecture, which I hope will be well received by our esteemed participants.
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Dr. Bindya Arora and Dr. Ravichand Singh, Dr. Saini, for coming this morning for this webinar. This is an opportunity for me to try this out. I must say that several years ago, I was asked to speak in a way that it could be recorded and transmitted, and I refused. I said, you know, I interact with live audiences and I cannot really speak to a camera or a computer or whatever. So I may not be my usual self. I'm doing it for the first time with the slide sharing and screen sharing and speaking on the web. But let's see how it goes. Also, this has been a very nice opportunity for me to learn something new in which I do not have much expertise. Of course, that was very interesting that I explored this whole area of quantum biology, which I'm going to talk to you. So at the outset, the disclaimer is that I am not an expert in quantum biology. I'm expert in quantum physics. But then to see how quantum physics, what kind of role it may play in biology, it's better starting point to be a quantum physicist, because you can connect with biology. If you are a pure biologist, you may not be able to connect with quantum physics. So there's always an advantage in being a physicist. You can connect with other sciences, including mathematics, and that opportunity may not be there with others. So GNDU, as Dr. Ravichand mentioned, is second home for me, and I have had interactions with the department from 1985 onwards, and I don't think there has been any year in which I have not interacted with the department. So I consider it as my own department, and it's always nice to interact with the department and the students. I am told that there are students who are from outside also who have registered for this webinar. Therefore, I am going to stick to speaking in English. Otherwise, at GNDU, many times I've given seminars on technical topics of physics in Punjabi because that also is something which I like to do. Anyway, so let's now begin with today's discussion. So I'm going to talk about quantum biology, a new frontier. And I must tell you that about 6 months ago, I myself did not know how interesting this new frontier is. So I am going to primarily share my excitement, which I have gained in the past 6 months about quantum biology with you. And also certain perspective on quantum physics, which is important to understand why this is a new frontier. First slide, I want to show you the kind of activities we have at IISER Mohali. IISER Mohali is a leading group in quantum physics. We recently organized a meeting, which was a consultative meeting for National Mission on Quantum Technologies and Applications, and we have a center called Center for Quantum Foundations, Technologies and Applications, and we have half a dozen faculty members who work in this area, and there are postdocs and students of the total order about 30-35 who work in quantum physics, quantum information, quantum foundations, and so on. So this is kind of a lead area at IISER Mohali, and many of you are finishing their masters and get interested in this area may want to apply to us. So this is the group photo of that meeting which happened in November 2019. See, quantum mechanics. Yeah. So this is a slide I was talking about, that recently we organized a meeting, which was a national consultative meet of DST, which we hosted, because there is a national mission on quantum technologies, which is coming up, which will be funded to the tune of 3,000 crores they're talking about. And IISER Mohali will be one of the hubs for that program. And we have a large group, which I was telling you about. Okay, good. Okay. So quantum mechanics was constructed in 1920s because the classical physics of 19th century could not explain many things. And primarily atomic spectra, black body radiation, photoelectric effect were the three things which could not be explained, and could not be explained in such a serious way that a new language had to be constructed to explain these phenomena. And that new language has many different nuances that we will talk about as we go forward. But after quantum mechanics was constructed in 1920s, 20th century is called a quantum century. And it was applied to atoms, to molecules, to nuclei, to particles, to materials, and you name it. And it has been one of the most successful stories in the history of physics. So far, no experimental evidence has been found which contradicts quantum physics. So quantum physics has been till today a theory for which there is no phenomena yet discovered which contradicts the quantum ideas. So all materials, all chemistry, all particles, everything is basically governed by laws of quantum physics. So it's all pervasive, and a whole century, which we call 20th century, was devoted to the development of quantum ideas in different fields. But it is not like the earlier physics. It has some aspects which are very different. So in earlier physics, or in the 19th century physics, whether it is electrodynamics or it is classical mechanics or it is thermodynamics, you can imagine a situation, which means you can imagine a particle, you can imagine its velocity, you can imagine movement, a set of particles, a field, a force. So all these things that can be imagined and intuitively thought about. Whereas situations in quantum physics may not be. So when you say that there is an electron in an orbital, now you have to just accept it, because you cannot say, oh, if it's an electron, then how is it an orbital? If it is an orbital, how it is an electron? If it is a density, then it should be a fluid. If it is a particle, it should be a point. So intuitive pictures that we have, or the intuitive motives for understanding that we have in our mind, do not apply to quantum physics. That is one major departure. The second major departure is probability. So in the classical world, we use probabilities to represent lack of knowledge, which means that if I don't know something, I assign a probability. For example, if somebody does not know that I'm giving a webinar to you sitting in this room at home, and in my institute somebody asks, where is Professor Arvind? Somebody will say, probably he is sitting at home, probably he is having a cup of tea, probably he is gone to the market, but no, markets are closed. So Probabilities are assigned based on partial knowledge and to express one's lack of knowledge. Whereas if somebody asks Dr. R.C. Singh or Dr. Bindya Arora, where is Professor Arvind, they will on the phone say, or the message say, oh, he is here giving a webinar. So there is no probability. So in the classical world, there is no real probability. When you don't know something, you assign probability. Even for a coin toss, when you throw a coin, the probability is assigned because we don't know what is going to come up, head or tail. However, if the laws of mechanics are followed and you precisely have a computer which will predict the motion of the coin, how many times it will turn, where it was hit, how high it went, you can predict whether head will come or tail will come. So there is no real probability in the classical world. Whereas in the quantum world, the probability is real. When you say that there is a Hermitian operator with 5 possible eigenvalues, you make a measurement and you will get one of them with such and such probability. There is nothing more. There is no more knowledge that either that system or God or anyone has about that system. That is the only knowledge about the system that we have, which is a probability. So probabilities are fundamental in quantum physics, and probabilities are not fundamental in classical physics. They are introduced as a device to express our lack of knowledge. Similarly, the space of theory in classical physics is actual space. Actual space, I mean that, you think about configuration space, particles moving, boxes, all that. Most of you, I imagine, are BSc third year or MSc students. So in quantum physics, the space in which we do theory is called a Hilbert space, which is a complex linear vector space. So you do theory in one space, and when you calculate the results or end results, those end results are kind of compared with experiments which you do in your laboratories. But the space of experiments is the real space, actual space in which a photon travels or an electron moves or a field is applied. But the space in which we do theory and make predictions about these systems is a complex linear vector space, which does not look like the physical space in which the objects actually exist. So that is also another serious departure of quantum physics from our classical view of looking at things. So the quantum world has a very different logic. So it is very important to appreciate that the first itself, the quanta, is a new concept. Before that, in the classical world, things were kind of continuous. So you have a fluid or a liquid or you have a continuum. Whereas Planck first introduced this whole idea that energy comes in packets or quanta, and you cannot break it down further. So there is certain discreteness in the world which is captured by quantum physics, whether it is the photon energy packets or it is to do with the discrete energy levels of atoms or harmonic oscillator or whatever. There is a certain discreteness which we call quantum, and the fundamental motifs in the world are discrete. So that is something which comes out of quantum physics, and it was introduced first time in quantum physics. We will see how this will get intimately connected with biology very soon when we move on. The second most important principle of quantum physics is superposition principle. Now, superposition principle is also very counterintuitive. So the quanta is not counterintuitive, because whether things are at a fundamental level or discrete or continuous, both are imaginable, because intuitively we have continuous things like water and we have discrete things like seeds or fruit and all that. I mean, you can have one banana, and bananas come always as discrete objects. So in nature, discreteness and continuum both are there, and in our mind also we can count countable things, 5 pencils, 3 balls, and so on, and we can also say 1 kg of atta, and we can say 1 liter of water. So we are used to intuitively dealing with both. On the other hand, the superposition principle of quantum physics, which says that if a situation A is physically allowed and a situation B is also physically allowed, then A and B are also allowed together. This is something which is very counterintuitive, because, for example, if I'm giving a webinar today, sitting here in this room to you, I cannot be playing cricket at the same time. So although it is possible, it is a Sunday, I mean, if it is a holiday, I can go and play cricket in the ground, or I can give a webinar. But I cannot do both at the same time. Whereas an quantum object like an electron can be present in more than one places at the same time. And that is called superposition principle. So if a situation A exists, a situation B exists, they can also exist together. The third major departure of quantum physics is that in the classical world, the measurements are readouts. So readout means that there is a value, there is something which exists. You go and look at it. You go and measure current, 5 amperes. You go and measure voltage, 4 amperes. You go and read a book. You learn what is on that page 16 of the book. Now, in the process of reading a book doesn't get affected. In the process of measuring the current doesn't get affected. Whereas in the quantum world, it's not like that. Measurements are interactive, which means that when a measurement is performed, there is certain back action of the measurement into the system and the values change after that. Two things can happen. One, of course, is the interactive measurements end up adding noise to the quantum system, and there's no passive reading out. But even more interesting is that since you cannot be a passive reader, like if there is a quantum book and if you want to read, you go to the library and you read a page. When somebody else goes to the library and reads the same page, the page will not be seen. You will leave some of your imprints on the page. So which means you cannot tamper with quantum information. So if there is an quantum information stored in a book in a library, I cannot go and just read it. I will end up leaving some mark of my presence in the book. And this is related to no cloning principle of quantum mechanics and is very intimately related to something called quantum cryptography, which is a subject which has developed in the past 20-30 years. Another feature of quantum measurements is that they can be non-compatible. So by that I mean that, if I ask you your name, then I ask your age, then I ask your class. So name is going to be, Simranpreet. Simranpreet is an MSc first year student, and she's whatever 20 years old. If I ask these 3 questions in sequence, name, class, age, I can ask them in any sequence. I can keep asking them, I'll get same answers. But in the quantum world, it's not like that. In the quantum world, what can happen is that first I ask name, I get an answer. Then I ask class, I get an answer. Then I ask age, I get an answer. Then I go back and ask this name. Now name can change because one measurement can affect the results which you had noted in your notebook from a previous measurement. So measurements need not be compatible. And that is what many times is expressed to you when quantum mechanics is taught, that Hermitian operators need not commute with each other. So all operators don't commute because they are represented by Hermitian matrices, and matrices in general do not commute. So this non-commuting or non-commutative nature of quantum mechanics reflects in measurements being non-compatible, and therefore the results of one measurement interfering in the results of the other. And second thing I told you, that quantum measurements are invasive. An imprint is left on the system when you make a measurement. In this list, the last thing I want to say is entanglement, that quantum correlation may not always have a local description. So this is a vast topic, and today I'm not going to really develop on it. Some other time I'll talk about it. But the whole idea is that when you do quantum physics of composite systems means more than one objects. When you do classical physics of more than one objects, you just represent them in phase space, and they occupy phase space positions. Each one has a position and a momenta. So 3 coordinates for position of one, 3 coordinates of the momentum for other, and 3 plus 3, it is what? 12-dimensional phase space. But that is not the case in quantum physics. In quantum physics, when you take 2 objects and do quantum mechanics for both of them, it is not just 1 plus 1. The reality of 2 objects can be bigger than 1 plus 1, which means that there might be situations of the composite system which cannot be thought of as one particle doing something, another particle doing something else. There are dances, the quantum dances of these particles, which can be thought of only being done together. You cannot think of one partner doing such a dance. So this is very interesting aspect of quantum mechanics, which plays a very important role in violation of Bell's inequalities in quantum non-locality. And people believe that when you build quantum computers, quantum entanglement plays a very important role, and it is in some sense a power or the resource behind uh, quantum computation. We will talk about that little bit on the next slide. What I want to say here is that superposition and entanglement are intimately related. So quantum entanglement is a consequence of quantum superposition. So superposition is such a non-trivial idea that it leads to another non-trivial consequence, which we call quantum entanglement. Now, it's very important to distinguish between micro versus macro, and also the logical aspects of quantum mechanics. Now, what I want to say is that from 1920s itself, we know that quantum mechanics is the language of fundamental particles, atoms, molecules, nuclei, all that, and so on. So this is nothing new about that. So all atoms follow quantum mechanics, therefore all molecules follow quantum mechanics, and so on. Semiconductors follow quantum mechanics, materials follow quantum mechanics. So semiconductors, the properties of some objects conducting in a certain way, therefore transistors, MOSFETs, all devices are based on quantum physics. Similarly, therefore computers, cell phones, all are based on quantum physics. Similarly, biological processes are based on chemical processes. Chemical processes are based on chemical reactions and bonds and shapes of molecules and so on, which are purely quantum. And when you say carbon is tetrahedron, the tetrahedron is the sp3 hybridization. There is no classical picture of that tetrahedron. Similarly, when you talk about bond angles and bond strengths and covalent bonds and ionic bonds, so all these are quantum. So quantum physics is behind all chemical phenomena. When two molecules come together and they react, the energy barriers, all that, again, quantum mechanics is needed to explain that. So then the question is, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about quantum computers if all computers already use quantum mechanics? Why are we talking about quantum biology if biological processes, which are primarily chemical processes, are already quantum in nature? So this is a question which needs to be answered and which is not clear to many people. So I thought I will dwell upon this. It is one thing to use quantum mechanics, which is happening behind the scenes at the micro level. And it is another thing to have a macroscopic quantum effect. So to give you an example, to have an electron being in an orbital inside a molecule is fine, because molecule anyway is so small and we can't see it. But let's assume that I have a micron size particle and I create a superposition of electron being on this end versus that end, which means it is a macroscopic scale of few microns or a half a centimeter or a millimeter across which I have superposition. That means that the kind of things which we see in the micro world, we are now witnessing those at the macro world. A very famous experiment which was done in this context was done by Zellinger's group, which started with this whole idea of looking for quantum superposition of bigger and bigger objects. So they started with molecules, bigger molecules, C60s, bigger particles of carbon with 500 atoms and 1000 atoms and so on. The idea is that what if, we can create situations where quantum effects can be seen at a macro level. But that would be a very bizarre thing, because it is one thing to say that electron is moving left and right at the same time. And it is a different thing to say that I have a 1 ampere current, but it is going clockwise and anti-clockwise at the same time. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I create a ring, superconducting ring, and then I say there's a 1 ampere supercurrent flowing clockwise. That is possible. Then I say that that will create a magnetic field. Then I say, oh, okay, there is a 1 ampere current which can flow anti-clockwise. Very good, that is also possible. But quantum superposition says that I can create a current state in which Anti-clockwise current and clockwise current, 1 ampere each, is possible simultaneously. What does it mean? Which way will be the magnetic field? What will I see? What will I not see? The whole logic and the framework which I have in my mind breaks down when you start saying that things which are exclusive can actually happen together. So those are called macroscopic quantum effects, and those are the ones which were never seen in 20th century. So 20th century quantum physics was primarily applicable to microscopic world. What happens is that when you begin or want to see these quantum effects, there is a phenomena called decoherence. As I told you that the quantum world is very fragile, quantum things can be, quantum effects can be destroyed very easily. So what happens is that this fragility and environmental effects come and kill these quantum effects. And there, the effect of these environmental effects and things is like a measurement, which means you see only one of the things. You will see only one of the currents. You will see me giving only one of the seminars and so on. So these fragile quantum effects get destroyed in the actual world, and we see only the classical world. So the classical world emerges out of the quantum world through a process called decoherence, which is induced by environment. So if you want to see those quantum effects at a larger scale, you have to control decoherence, which is a very, very difficult task and one of the main hurdles in front of building quantum computers. The third non-trivial aspect is that a regular computer, which we have, of course, uses quantum effects inside the devices of semiconductors and MOSFETs and gates and things and so on. However, the logic it uses is classical, which means you only use AND gate, OR gate, and NAND gate, and so on. You cannot say, oh, this is a gate which is AND and OR simultaneously. Such logic is not allowed. Whereas in a quantum computer, such logic should be allowed. And what happens is that if you want to allow such logic, you need to have quantum coherence prevail across components. And therefore, it gets connected with control of decoherence and macro level quantum mechanics. So the message here is that there are two different kinds of consequences of quantum mechanics. One are for the microcosm, which is a 20th century story, and one is these effects at new time scales, new length scales, and new mass scales. So number of particles, number of amount, space in which they exist, and time over which they can exist. When that scale changes to a larger scale of the macro world, then we call it non-trivial macro quantum effects. And those are very difficult to see because they get killed by the process of decoherence, and they need to be controlled if you want to build a quantum computer. And when I'm saying quantum biology, so to tell you, such effects, if they are seen in biological systems, then we will call them quantum biological effects. Not those which are already known that biology is based on chemistry and chemistry is based on quantum physics. So therefore all biology is quantum. That is not the level of quantumness that we are talking about when we talk about the new vistas in quantum biology. So in quantum information processing, a lot of progress has happened in the past 20-30 years. The whole game started with quantum cryptography, which came up in 1980s and 1990s primarily. Then quantum algorithms, which came in the last decade of 20th century, and then quantum simulations, which were suggested earlier, and some of which have now become possible. So the point is that these non-trivial, large scale, large time scale and large length scale quantum effects have now been created in the laboratories in 21st century. And not just that they have been created, they are being harnessed to do information processing. And that is what we call quantum information processing, which is something we can talk about another day. But that's very intimately connected with today's talk, as you will see as we go on. So therefore, when I say quantum biology, I'm talking about manifestations of quantum effects at length scales, time scales, and temperatures where they typically are difficult to find. Macro effects, quantum logic or quantum computation. These are the kind of effects, if they're seen in biological systems, we call them quantum biology. Of course, there are other connections between quantum physics and biology, which also we will talk about as we go along. Now let me take a step back. I will come to those effects in a while. At a very philosophical level, if you look, I don't know how many of you have studied biology, but Mendel in 1866 proposed that the motifs of hereditary is discrete. When he did his experiment with pea plants, he found that the basic motifs are discrete. They are not continuous. But at that time, people were not willing to believe. So even when Darwin developed his theory of evolution, he did not use Mendel's idea of discrete motifs, because instead he used blending theory of heritage, which is actually wrong. So in evolutionary biology, the fact that motifs are actually discrete was accepted only in 1920s or 1910s. I mean, after 1900 only, the whole idea of discrete motifs of going from one generation to another generation was accepted. Of course, it took much longer time for people to find DNA and see that genes are discrete motifs. That is a physical discovery of those. But conceptually, Mendel, from his experiments with peas, had concluded that the traits are passed on discretely and not continuously. And that was a very difficult thing to believe for biologists. They did not agree with it. Even Darwin did not agree with it. Only in the beginning of 20th century, biologists agreed to that. And of course, the actual physical evidence for discrete genes and genetic code came much later. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is the same time when originally the Planck introduced the quanta in physics. So the quantization of information in DNA in terms of genes and quantization of energy and so on in physics became acceptable at the same time, and historians of science believe that it is not incidental. Since physicists had accepted this whole idea of discreteness, it was easier for biologists to accept Mendel's non-trivial and very, very fundamental ideas. So it took about 30, 40 years for discreteness to get accepted in biology in terms of discrete motifs for traits in terms of genes. So, and these ideas were born in physics and biology in the beginning of 20th century. So it's a very nice connection, which physicists should know. The second connection is again between Darwin's theory and quantum mechanics. That quantum mechanics is primarily probabilistic. As I told you, that if there are possibilities, which possibility will be shown when you do a quantum measurement is something which is completely probabilistic. We only know probabilities, we don't know the actualities. Same is true with biology. Everyone knows that the probability of a boy or a girl born is roughly equal, 50%. However, when a given child is born, you don't know, nobody can predict that this particular child is going to be a boy or a girl. So the probability is given, the actuality is one of those possibilities. And it is not that someone knows. No one knows unless the fertilization of the egg has already happened. Then of course you can do an experiment and know. But that is after the decision has happened. The fundamental decision making process in biology at many levels is probabilistic, like quantum mechanics. Similarly, the nature throws out possibilities in terms of mutations, which are random. So you could have in the next generation, you can have 2 or 3 features which have been added randomly, which is probabilistic. And then natural selection selects one of them, and that survives in the population. So that is again very close to the spirit of quantum mechanics, that there are laws, but laws work at the level of probabilities and not at the level of actualities. So this is again a very, very deep similarity between Darwin's theory of evolution and the probabilities in quantum mechanics. So this is at one level that we have connections. It has been summarized that recently in a very nice article by Seth Lloyd, that quantum physics has given several gifts to nature. So he calls it gift 1, gift 2, gift 3, gift 4, like that. So stability. So he says stability is something because the atoms would not have been stable in the classical world. As you know, electron going around the nucleus will radiate and stability will not be there. Countability, because all matter is discrete in quantum physics. So whole idea of counting, although it is older than quantum mechanics, but final validation that the word is discrete comes from quantum mechanics. Information. The fundamental units of information are discrete, whether it is life, DNA, or bits or qubits is also a quantum phenomenon. I mean, quantum means discrete phenomena. I don't mean exactly only quantum physics the way we learn it. So information processing, which happens again, uses quantum ideas. Randomness in the word, as we said, the probability is fundamentally quantum. There is no probability in the classical world. So therefore, quantum way of thinking enriches our way in a very big way. And that is very close to the biological world. That's what you see, that the Darwin's way of looking at natural selection and evolution has these ideas, some of the ideas which we ascribe to quantum physics, closely related with that. Now let us come to some examples of the kind of quantum phenomena I was talking about, which recently has been found to exist in biological systems. So what has been found is that there are certain kind of cyanobacteria which do photosynthesis at very, very low light conditions. And what they do is they use quantum random walks. I will not be able to get into technical details, but when the point is, what was found was that when a photon is captured by the bacteria, like a photon is captured on the leaf, it has to be transported to a place where the energy is actually converted into glucose. After all, the process of photosynthesis is that you absorb light, convert that energy into chemical energy. So that's converted to a chemical bond in the presence of this. I mean, photosynthesis is the process. Chlorophyll plays an important role. So what was found was that efficiency of this absorption and transport of photon from the absorption site to the binding site is so fast that there is so fast and so efficient. 99.999% photons are absorbed, nothing is lost, they are transported in no time. No classical model of transport could explain this. And now people have come up with a model of transport based on quantum walks inside the bacteria at length scales, time scales, and temperatures, which nobody thought that quantum phenomena could actually exist. So it's a very, very exciting area which is emerging, where people are saying that there are quantum aspects to photosynthesis, which are quantum computations in terms of random walks, quantum random walks being performed by photons from the place where they are captured to the place where they actually go and bind. So this is one example. The second example is olfaction. Now, olfaction is something which we all know is a very, very complex process, the sense of smell. We are able to distinguish a large number of smells. Dogs are able to distinguish even more number of smells. And for a long time, people have been trying to understand how do we actually smell? And there was a theory for smell which has been around for a very long time, which was based on it's called a shape theory. So the theory is that we have a receptor in our nose, which are molecules, and when a gas or a material which has smell goes there, because of the shape, so this is the molecule, say H2S, and there is a receptor for H2S, it goes and binds, it fits in, and therefore that receptor says, oh, this, and then it sends a signal to our brain and we smell. This has been the widely accepted theory of smell for a long time. Till people did more and more experiments, and then they saw that two molecules which have same shape can have very different smell. Therefore, shape theory is wrong. So experimentally, and this also tells you that how scientists are very curious. Scientists don't really accept what other scientists say. They always go and verify. And therefore, curiosity is very important. So this well-established shape theory was challenged, and then people did controlled experiments and showed that there is no correlation between shape and smell. So definitely there is something else which is involved. And then came one theory, so many theories. Currently it is believed, and more experiments will have to be done. There is a very interesting theory called quantum theory of smell. The quantum theory of smell is that when the molecule goes and fits into the detector or the receptor, um, there is a electron which tunnels through this molecule. So this is the quantum well, which is there in the receptor. This molecule comes and fits, and now one electron from here will tunnel to the bottom. And the tunneling rate depends on the Raman modes of the molecule that you have put in. So inside our nose, Raman spectroscopy is being done inside these receptors at scales which are not molecular, much bigger than single molecule scales. And that tunneling rate in some sense measures the Raman mode of the molecule. And therefore, smell can be correlated with Raman modes. And this has been verified. People have taken molecules of same shape, and if they have different Raman modes, they have different smells. So there is a good amount of evidence building that quantum tunneling is involved in detection of smell. It is not just a shape of the molecules which decide the smell, and a lot of interesting literature is coming in this direction about quantum theory of olfaction. The third example I want to give you is avian compass. As you know that birds can navigate over very, very large distances, and people always think that there is a magnetic field of the earth is guiding them to navigate and and things like that. And what happens really is that people thought there are tiny magnets inside birds, and those tiny magnets get aligned, or they can sense like a compass. It's like a compass inside the animal, and that compass basically can find the direction from the north-south direction of the earth. Again, people wanted to test this theory, and particular species of birds is called European robins. European robins were studied for their navigation abilities. They can navigate very well. Now, 3 things were found. Number one, they are able to navigate only when there's light. So light plays some role. Then they found that they did not have any magnetic material inside their body which could align with the magnetic field of the earth. How do they find their way? What is the compass inside? Then it's a long story and can become a lecture in itself. Today's idea was to just give you examples. So now the current theory is very interesting. It's a quantum theory of avian compass. Inside the eye of the bird, a photon is absorbed. And when a photon is absorbed, a quantum superposition at a large length scale is created, which is very sensitive to magnetic field. So it's not a magnet. It is a quantum superposition which is sensitive to magnetic field, an angle of the magnetic field. And because of the Earth's magnetic field, at 2 different locations, a certain chemical reaction has 2 different rates. So it's a differential rate of a chemical reaction depending on the magnetic field direction inside the eye of the bird, and there's a quantum superposition of that. And when bird is flying, this reaction rate is changing because of the direction. And that leads to a signal in the brain of the bird. And then, of course, the regular biological feedback mechanism comes in and tells the bird which is the direction. So it is not the tiny magnets inside the bird which is aligning. It is a quantum superposition of 2 states, 2 chemical reaction rates, which are affected by the magnetic field, and thereby the bird is able to find its way. So this also has attracted a lot of attention in nature papers and so on, and people are still working, and people are trying to find other examples, people are trying to find other models, and a very, very important positive feedback which went into research was that people were able to create the same situation in the laboratory. So people have done laboratory experiments of generating these differential reactions where a photon comes, starts a reaction, reaction rates in two different locations are angle dependent, dependent on the angle of the magnetic field, and from there you can find, birds can find their way. So that was a third example I wanted to mention to you. When we open for discussion, we will see what you have in mind and so on and so forth. The last one I want to put on the table is that, as you all know, that well, you may not, I don't know, your physics students, but everyone should know that 20 amino acids are there which form all the proteins. By the way, proteins are basic ingredients. Everything is a protein, and proteins are to various various roles they play in our body. I mean, hemoglobin is a protein, and chlorophyll is a protein, and every protein is designed to perform a certain function. And protein structure is coded in DNA. So DNA has 4 base pairs. It has genes, and genes have 4 base pairs. So when a protein is formed, it is like a machine. So you read out information from the DNA, and then you make protein. So a long protein is made. Now, by the way, we are protein machines. So we can make proteins in the laboratory because you just need to pass on info. So it's exactly like a computer. There is a long DNA which has information A, T, G, S. So which has to be put. So you assemble basically amino acids in a long chain, and that's a protein. Then it is designed, it folds and becomes a structure, and then it is a machine which does the function it has to do. So this is what is called protein synthesis. I mean, the Indian scientist Hargobind Khurana was strongly involved in the unraveling of protein synthesis through RNA. He got Nobel Prize for that and so on. You must have heard his name and things. But the question is, why has nature chosen 4 base pairs to code for 20 amino acids? What is this 4 and 20? Why not 10 and 2? Why not 50 and 6? Why not 8 and 3? What is this mystery of 4 and 20? For a while now, there is a conjecture which is becoming popular, although it's not yet verified in any way, that this is to do with Grover's search algorithm in quantum physics. So you have to search the code and construct the amino acids, and that process is actually a quantum computation based on Grover's search algorithm. So in Grover's search algorithm, you can show that 4 and 20 will be one of the very efficient ways of carrying out this process, and therefore nature has stabilized to a very efficient minimum of resources, which is 4 and 20. So I presented to you 4 examples today. The photosynthesis in bacteria, which involves quantum random walks, olfaction, which is the sense of smell, which currently the best possible explanation is based on quantum tunneling and Raman spectroscopy. Birds might be navigating based on large-scale quantum superposition inside their eyes. And the basic mystery of protein synthesis, where 20 amino acids are assembled into proteins using 4 base pairs, might be related to quantum search algorithm due to Love-Grover. And I also mentioned earlier that the quantum ideas and the ideas of Darwinian selection and randomness in biology are not only closely related, they also emerged almost at the same time. So I would like to conclude with a somewhat philosophical remark. See, if you see, in Gurbani also it comes that life is like pani upar budbuda. It is like a bubble on water which can burst anytime, which means it is very fragile. Still, it is very robust. Why it is robust? Because of evolution. So we have evolved complex systems to protect our fragility. So we are very fragile. Inside our process are very fragile. When a doctor opens up in your heart or whatever, it's a non-trivial task to close it, because any small thing can kill you. One poison, snake bites you, the poison spread. So we are very, very fragile, yet very robust. Why? Because robust structures have evolved to protect this fragile life. What are we trying to do in quantum computation? Fragile quantum effects we want to protect by building all kinds of protective mechanisms which we call control of decoherence. Therefore, it is very likely that inside biological systems, when so much fragility has been protected, there are already motifs, there are already designs and structures which preserve quantum effects, quantum coherences, quantum entanglement, and so on, and use them for various biological purposes. So therefore, it might be that the 4 examples which I gave you is tip of the iceberg. It is beginning of the story. And that's why I titled my talk as A New Frontier. So 21st century may open up this new frontier where you will be maybe engaging with biological systems inside which you will see fragile quantum effects being stored, protected, and harnessed for biological purpose. So maybe I will end my lecture here. It is also 12 o'clock roughly, and then we can open the session for discussion. Over to the organizers, Dr. Bindya Arora, for coordinating the discussion. Maybe for 15 minutes or so, we can open the discussion.
Sure. So I thank you for such an insightful talk. They were very interesting points which I would like to discuss with you after this talk perhaps. We have few questions and maybe there are more coming up. First 2 questions we have are from Jyoti Arora and Priyadarshi. So I'm unmuting Jyoti and I request Jyoti to kindly turn on your video and introduce yourself.
Hello?
Yeah. Yes, Jyoti, we can hear you. So kindly give a brief introduction and ask a question.
Hello sir, I am Jyoti. I am doing PhD in atomic and molecular spectroscopy. I have a question. Is there any possibility if we try to find out about the post-Haydn times and the evolution of mankind at that time using this quantum biology and computational methods?
Now say it again. I did not get your question. Find what?
So her question is, do you think that there is a way to solve the mystery of post-Haydn times and the evolution of human beings using quantum biology and computation?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of understanding of human evolution anyway. I mean, so immediately whether quantum effects are present in that process, I don't know, but computation and computational methods are heavily used in the area of understanding biological evolution. And that understanding keeps becoming more and more refined as we go on. Yeah.
Okay, sir.
So does that answer your question, Jyoti?
Okay.
Actually, ma'am, I had done my science project, master's project in GN for DNA. There was a work that we had to change the geometry of the particle to chromosomal geometry, and we tried to work on that. That we had to work on finding the mystery of post-Haydn times, like when the Earth, when there was the triggering of mankind, right? How did the first organic molecule formed for which the human beings start evolving? That's why I wanted to ask this question. If there is any way that we can find an algorithm and try to simulate all those times and find out how this mankind first triggered.
I think there are 2 questions. One is origin of life. Those organic molecules you're talking about is the origin of life question. A lot of work people do on that. The evolution of mankind is a different question. When did humans come in and so on? Computational methods are used heavily in these areas, as I told you. Exactly where quantum ideas will come in, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. So I'll mute you. Next question is from Priyadarshi. So Priyadarshi, I'm unmuting you. And you may turn on your video. Priyadarshi.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please ask your question. Give a brief
Yes,
introduction.
Priyadarshi, I can hear you.
Okay. So my name is Priyadarshi and I'm from BSc Honors Physics last semester. I didn't know about quantum mechanics much, but my question is like Earth's magnetic field is very small enough to perform a thermal reaction inside the bonds of cryptochrome inside the eye of the birds. So how it is possible that it could lead a reaction and that reaction leads to a biological signal?
Yeah, so it is not that reaction is caused by the magnetic field. The reaction is sensitive to the magnetic field. Reaction is caused by the photon which hits the eye. So you have to get into the detail. I can share the paper with you. So the point is that the reaction is sensitive to magnetic field. It is not caused by the magnetic field, right? So the reaction is so sensitive because it's based on a certain quantum superposition that that sensitivity depends on the rate of the reaction depends on magnetic field. The cause of the reaction is the photon which is absorbed in the air.
Sir, superposition can define it or quantum entanglement can define it because quantum entanglement is much related to this aspect.
Yes?
Sir, quantum entanglement I feel is more relevant to this theory of navigation.
No, you think means have you read more about bird navigation?
No, sir, I have just watched a video on YouTube and they said that quantum entanglement defines the quantum navigation in the words. Like if
So the singlet state which is created, as I mentioned, after the photon is absorbed, and that is dependent on the magnetic. The reaction is the rate is dependent on the magnetic field. That is precisely the point.
Okay, thank you, sir.
See, quantum entanglement between two is basically a superposition. It's called the singlet triplet reaction ratio. That rate is magnetic field dependent. That's what is precisely is the point. Yes.
Okay.
The next question is from Harpreet Singh. So Harpreet, I'm unmuting you. You just, yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Good afternoon, Dr. Arvind. I'm Dr. Harpreet from HME Jalandhar, and I have been interacting with Dr. Arvind on his favorite popular talks in physics during Inspire camps. But this is the first time I have seen him talking in my field. So, being a biologist, I will start from the last slide, which probably the last slide, which is ended like we are 4 bases of nucleotides DNA, which code for 20 amino acids in a very selective process. So I just wanted to know that there's another theory, there's another advancement in this science that these DNA's methods, DNA molecules are further modified. Well, with some chemical reactions like DNA methylation and so on, and which actually make them to decide what to code or what not to code. So are we applying quantum mechanics methods or quantum physics to deal with such processes?
I know what you're talking about. Basically, you're talking about the epigenetic effects where you can
yes, exactly, yeah,
switch on and switch on depending on DNA methylation. Not to my knowledge. I don't think anybody has applied quantum mechanics to understand that particular process.
Okay, thank you, sir.
But that is more like microscopic. In some sense, all chemical reactions are anyway quantum. So any process where a methyl group is getting it. So, but that is quantum mechanics at micro level, which is anyway we have to accept and work with at all chemical reactions. So quantum chemistry will be applied there. But nice to
Thank you.
see you on this. So,
Thank you, sir.
Mandeep, can you please turn on your video so that we can see you?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, my name is Harmandeep Singh and I am from Khalsa College and I am doing
Okay.
BSc and I am in 4th semester, and my question is that is decoherence possible in nature or not? Or it is a
decoherence is
limitation?
always there. Yeah, so decoherence is the bad thing. It is the noise. So it is omnipresent. That is why you have to, is the other way, you have to get rid of decoherence to see quantum effects. So decoherence is so much present that we need to, it's like saying that you want to see something, therefore you have to remove all the noise from it, from the signal.
Yes,
So
sir. Yes, sir. You already explained, as you had already
Yeah.
explained that decoherence is present in nature. So
Yes.
I want to know that, as you said that scientists are creating some way to remove decoherence. So is it now possible or not?
Well, there's no yes no answer. We have managed to control decoherence to a great extent and create situations where we can control it. But still we have a long way to go. You know, whether you can control it for one molecule for 10 seconds or for 1,000 molecules for 2 hours. So quantitatively one has to answer this. In past 25 years, a lot of progress has happened in the domain of controlling decoherence. And that's why today we have basic quantum computers which are already working. But we have a long way to go. So people believe by the end of 21st century, we will have much more control over decoherence, that quantum devices will be commonplace.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So I'm okay. The next Shraddha has raised his hand. So I'm unmuting Shraddha. Can you please turn on your video?
Yes. My name is Shraddha and I'm pursuing BSc B.Ed in the Khalsa College of Education. My question is for sir that means it's proved that one particle can occur at two places simultaneously. As you gave example of current, it can be anti-clockwise and clockwise simultaneously. But it's our that assumption that we cannot measure it. But it actually can occur simultaneously, but we can't measure or see.
So science is about what you can measure. So if you cannot measure directly, you will have to find ways of measuring indirectly. Because in science, it is meaningless to say that something exists, but I cannot see it. That is called metaphysics. That is not science. That's like God. People want to believe in it without having any specific evidence that it is there. So these superpositions that we are talking about, there is, in an experiment, one has to find indirect evidence of their existence. Not being able to see is not an excuse in science. You have to find a way to see. And that way might be very non-trivial and may not be very direct. Otherwise, we will not put it in the domain of science.
Okay. Professor Saini, I would request you to kindly close the ceremony officially.
Again, thanks Arvind and all the participants who joined this meeting. I hope in future Dr. Arvind will be available for another lectures. I thank you all, everybody participating in this webinar seminar.
Thank you, Saini sir. Thanks a lot. So with this, I would like to officially end the meeting. So take care. Thanks, Professor Arvind. Thanks a lot.
Okay, most welcome. I enjoy.